and the webinar is starting off with a few technical issues, but we're swiftly getting that sorted. This is the July 2018 Fresh School Health and Nutrition webinar. My name is Mohini Venkatesh, and I'm from Save the Children. Brief introduction on the Fresh webinars. They're a series of monthly presentations on school health and development in low and middle income contexts, jointly organized by Fresh partners. And each month we commemorate a special health day and speak on the topic where we bring in researchers, policymakers, and practitioners to share their knowledge and experience. And this month we're celebrating World Youth Skills Day, which took place yesterday. And when one speaks of youth skills, rightly so, we think of vocational skills, labor markets, transition of youth from schools to institutions, from schools and institutions of learning to the workplace. And in today's Fresh webinar, we're going to take a step back and look at the more foundational and basic skills that are needed in the context where we work, and it relates to health, personal, and social development. To speak on the topic and to tell us more about what this means and why it's relevant to youth skills, we have three guest speakers. Our first speaker is well known in the Fresh Network, Doug McCall. He's the Executive Director of the International School Health Network. His 3 decades of work on school health has been shaped by his previous job as a teacher, union leader, community organizer, and lobbyist. We also have David Selby, founder of Sustainability Frontiers, on the line as presenter. David Selby has a long-standing international reputation for his work on life skills and sustainability-related education, and we'll be hearing more about how community-based and extracurricular learning can be more effective when linked with formal curriculum. And lastly, we have Daniel Leith, an associate professor at Simon Fraser University, Canada, to speak on the policy implications around this work. So over to our speakers and over to our first speaker, Doug McCall. Doug? Doug, are you on the line?
Sorry, I've got to click my microphone. Yes, I am on the line. Yeah, and the second slide is showing up, which is the purposes of this session. Maybe a quick word: when I use the term, or we use the term health, personal, and social development education, there's a number of variations on that theme that we'll get into in a bit, but it is covering what some people call health education, or some people call life skills education, and so on. And the first purpose of this, very briefly, is to give you a bit of recall or review of health HPSD education and the work that the Fresh Working Group has been doing on that topic, along with an international research network that Dan chairs, and also a nascent consortium of education and other faculties that is being formed. Our second presenter, David, will be looking at the possibilities of community working to help students learn in the community, and has some really interesting examples of that. Our third will be looking at some of the pitfalls and practical issues in classroom-based health, personal and social development education. And it's been a while since I've looked at these, and I'm actually quite concerned about how much we've avoided those issues. So we'll talk about that for briefly. And then Dan will take us to a sort of a more reflective level and look at this issue from an education policy person perspective. And so those are the 4 objectives for the session. just the relevance, policy relevance. Health education is part of both of school health promotion and many other different models, child-friendly schools, a whole bunch of different models like that. And everybody in those models are multi-component approaches. Health education, health, personal, and social development education is part of the key components. And of course, very relevant to the 2030 education goals. In fact, one of the accomplishments of FRESH was to, in the world discussion in Incheon, and in the formation of the 2030 framework for action on education, health and life skills, those words were brought into that framework, and so we're quite pleased. This is the mandate of our FRESH working group. You can see it's covering a lot of territory. There's a number of different paradigms. You're going to learn about one of those paradigms today from David, but there are a whole bunch of different ways of looking at health and social development, and so without going into those, that's the mandate of the working group that we're trying to address, and to try to recognize how many competing paradigms and how so many issues are being, our schools are being asked to address them. This is a slide that came out of our work, and it's hard to see, but I'm just going to, if you look closely, you'll see that there are a number of different ways that health and personal and social development education can be promoted, both within the classroom and in other parts of the school day, and indeed in the community. And if you look at the bottom of the circle there, you'll see school cooperation with community youth programs, school participation in community activities and programs, and that's quite a bit what David will be talking about when he begins his remarks. And if you look at the top of the circle, you'll see extracurricular activities, co-curricular activities. In the session description, David and Fumio, who's also on the line, did an excellent report, which led me to them to ask them to participate in this session. It was a 2012 report, and they were looking at those kinds of activities as well as the community-based activities. And it's a really interesting report from 30 different countries, and it helps to get a sense of reality. So that gives us kind of the scope of what we mean by both formal and informal health, personal, and social development education, and keep that in mind as we're working through it. Our next web meeting as part of the work group, we'll be looking at the cross-curricular elements, and that's going to be the last step in trying to get a bit of a scoping look at what does exist and what the possibilities and practicalities are. So, David, if you could take over the presentation and just tell me when you need to advance the slides.
Okay, can you hear me, Doug? Yes. Okay. Well, hello everybody, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I'd like to look at the issue of stretching curriculum time by looking at our work, our being Sustainability Frontiers, an academic non-governmental organisation, our work in disaster risk reduction and climate change education, including climate change adaptation and mitigation. What I would like to do is to explain and give some instances of how we combine student curricular experiences with engagement in campus affairs, and also with learning experiences in and with the community, and first implicitly, then I guess explicitly, raising the question of what does this mean in terms of curriculum time? Where stands curriculum time if you take such a model? Next. Disaster risk reduction and disaster risk reduction education, its educational counterpart, are really responses to the increasing incidence and severity of disaster globally. This first slide is of the Philippines, Typhoon Haiyan. But next, we cannot thereby, as some do, many do in the so-called metaphorical north, put this down to something that happens elsewhere and not at home. Here we have an example of Tasmanian bushfires in 2013 in a very developed country. And next, a picture from the devastating Japanese earthquake, tsunami, and consequent nuclear disaster. This happened in northeastern Japan in 2011. These are the increasing severity and increasing incidence of these kind of disasters lies very much behind what disaster risk reduction education is. Next. DRR in education has been broadly described as involving a combination of actions, processes, and attitudes, necessity for minimizing underlying causes of vulnerability and building resilience. And this slide is intended to give some idea of the content and scope. Very much initially, it was concerned with climatological and geoseismic disasters caused by hazards of a natural origin. The examples are given there: floods, storms, earthquakes, volcanoes. The field has shifted now to also include human-caused hazards such as landmines, biohazards, and other such things. And the whole field too has been advanced, particularly perhaps in Western and Central Africa, in terms of integrating peace education with disaster risk reduction education. So we get DRR, something called, as it is called, DRR plus, or CDRR, which is conflict and disaster risk reduction education. So the whole field has expanded. There's also an increasing tendency for curricula to cover what we call slow onset disasters, biodiversity loss, and crucial desertification, and crucially climate change education. And it deserves pointing out that the Sustainable Development Goals do cover this key dimension of education. Seeing disaster and sustainability as in negative correlation, you can't sustain if you're facing constant bouts, a constant procession of disaster, and resilience and sustainability being in positive correlation. Next. So what I'd like to do is present briefly a five-dimensional model of disaster risk reduction education that we've been working on in a range of countries, particularly in Asia, but elsewhere too. And we see DRRE as having five essential dimensions. And I think as we look at them, something ought to become pretty clear, that the whole approach begins with a very very limited curricular spread, and what you can see is a widening circle of curriculum engagement as we move through the dimensions. So the first basic dimension is that of understanding the science and mechanisms of hazard, and really this has fitted in fairly naturally into geography and natural and physical science curriculum, where geoseismic issues and climatological issues have long been covered. This has been the predominant approach until quite recently, and is restricted really to these subjects. Next. The second area of DRR learning takes us into learning and practicing safety measures and procedures. This is about the basic idea, linking very much to health education, of helping students understand how to cope with various kinds of disaster should they happen, how to help each other, how to support each other, how to protect themselves, how to stay safe from hazards, and so how to understand early signage of an impending disaster. So very much elements to do with first aid and looking after oneself and one's peers. And this approach dancing really between being extracurricular and a kind of attachment to the dimension one in physical science, but not really spreading across the curriculum very much. I've lost the pictures.
Yeah, so have I. I think it's I'm not.
So have I.
I'll try again. I'm not sure what's happening here.
I think there's right at the bottom of the screen, you can see the manage content, and the PowerPoint slides are in there. So for anyone who's not got access to the PowerPoint, it's in your screen just at the bottom. If you click on the button next to the phone, manage content, and you should be able to download it while we try to fix this problem. Doug, are you trying to load it back on again?
Yeah. Yes, I am.
Okay, cool.
It may be my connection. Sometimes it's slow as well, but this has not happened before. I apologize if it's, well, data flow is data flow. Technology is great when it works.
Just to say to Mohini, I don't get a download option on my, when I click on the screen. Anyway, yeah, we've got to come back. We're back.
I will try to attach the PowerPoint on the chat box. So in case we have this problem again, folks can directly get the slides from the chat box.
David, I think we're back to where you were.
We're back. That's great. Thanks, Doug. Yeah, I was mentioning that under this particular element, all kinds of things are done by schools. Emergency drills and exercises against particular hazards, familiarization with basic first aid and health and safety measures. In Vanuatu, we worked on cyclone safety procedures for children, and also tsunami safety procedures. So these would be the things which would go under this particular dimension. And as I said, it kind of hovers in the extracurricular or co-curricular area, sometimes appearing in the curriculum largely as built on the shoulders of the science-based approach I discussed before. Next slide, please. This is a simple example of these of Dimension 2 in practice in two Asian countries. Next, please. The third dimension takes us into understanding risk drivers and how hazards can morph into disasters. A critical issue here is with helping students and helping learners understand the difference between a hazard and a disaster. There can, of course, be disasters which are so great they are, no question, disasters as such. In many cases, hazards morph into disaster because of the lack of capacity, the lack of capabilities for withstanding hazards in particular communities. And in this dimension, we look at this notion of vulnerability and invite students to engage in things like vulnerability and capacity transects across their community, collecting data, bringing it back to classroom, and weaving it into the curriculum of a range of subjects. This particular approach, which looks at drivers which might be causing this, such as the literacy, such as material weaknesses in material design in a community, lack of health security, lack of social cohesion, the peripheral position of minorities. These raise a range of issues which takes DR learning firmly into the social sciences. Next, please. The fourth dimension looks at issues of resilience building, focusing on the concept of resilience and how to build adaptation to risk, how to mitigate hazard effects, and more deeply, how to mitigate hazard drivers, those things which deep down are causing these hazards to become more frequent, to become more violent. It is an approach which combines indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge, and again, it asks students to engage with adults in mapping community capacity and in projects that try to build and reinforce that capacity. So students oftentimes under this heading going out into the community to engage in disaster risk reduction work and resilience building projects, and oftentimes this same work bringing adults and experts into the classroom as part of the curriculum experience. Next, please. We broaden this then to look at the notion of building an institutional and community-wide culture of what we call safety and resilience. I'll explain this more in a moment, but basically engaging students in safe school initiatives on their own campus, and students also becoming a key agency factor in the school becoming a hub of community resilience building. There are implications here for ensuring that we have a highly localized curriculum. So moving that point on with the next slide, Doug. This is the basic model under which most UN work on disaster risk reduction is actually happening, and is seen as a model that involves ensuring safe school facilities, of course, ensure retrofitting schools, moving schools if they're in dangerous places that might be subject to hazard, strengthening the school, strengthening the perimeter of the school, cutting down hazard possibilities. Then what we call school disaster management, which involves the school as an institution managing risk by conducting hazard surveys of the school, improving the quality of the school, for the students in the community, but also the adults in the community, building mindfulness of disaster risk altogether, and then disaster prevention education, which takes us into the curriculum area. And I guess what we're talking about here is expanding the disaster prevention education piece from being simply within the walls of the classroom to engage students themselves in safe school facilities, and indeed in the management and decision making as to what happens in schools. And at this point, the question comes: where does curriculum begin and where does curriculum end? Next slide, please. Another way to see this is another model, and it's what our own model is to see curriculum, campus, and community as elements of the total school culture and building a culture of safety and resilience. The argument being that the curriculum must address these issues according to the 5 dimensions, but the 5 dimensions can only become operative if the students are engaged in the campus and likewise engaged in the community. And all sorts of possibilities come up. Under campus, for instance, the students might conduct and exhibit school safety photographic surveys and give community presentations. They might be involved in tree planting in the school grounds. they might be involved in processes to make the school carbon neutral. Under the community heading, they may collect oral histories of community members' hazard-related appearances. They may hold periodic student hearings in which notables in the community come and listen to the students, what the students have worked out in class as the problems and anxieties about disaster risk. They may be involved, for instance, as we've had cases of this, of students developing a bi-monthly community newsletter going out to all members of the community to conscientize them to risk issues. Basically, if we take this idea of the 3 C's and then the overarching 4C of building a culture of safety and resilience, I think this is another way of saying that we're turning the school from being conceived of as a teaching organisation to being seen as a wholesale learning organisation, or rather than organisation, a teaching community to a learning community in its fullness of an idea. Next slide, please. This is an example of an HVCA, hazard, vulnerability and capacity assessment, involving children. Children find out about past patterns of hazards and so on in the community, talking to older members. They carry out hazard mapping or transect, walking through the community and often with experts and identifying problems in the community which may increase vulnerability. They find out and think about defences and safeguards, putting capacity in place. They learn about seasonal hazards and develop local hazard calendars. They make presentations to community and locality. This is a process we've seen in numerous countries happening now. Next slide, please. And here's a picture of a group of students, younger primary students, who've just done a hazard mapping and are putting this on paper, and subsequently they set up displays for community members to come and see, the children hosting them and talking about what they found about the community, and that leading as a springboard for co-action, student involvement, student agency, along with parents and community members in changing things in the community. Next slide, please. This is an example from Morover Lagoon in the Solomon Islands, a wonderful project concerned here with ensuring the biodiversity of what is one of the most biodiversity-rich places on Earth. And the students were involved in, firstly, let's say that you see there a book on the left, a book cover on the left. That's an encyclopedia, environmental encyclopedia on Morover Lagoon, published as part of the UNESCO Links project in 2005. And it was thought a very good idea for a range, maybe 8, I think it was 7 or 8 primary and secondary students on the Morover Lagoon area, to take that forward, to choose some species or animal or plant species or some natural phenomenon, and themselves in little groups go out into the community, talk to elders, talk to fisher folk, talk to whoever, and create extra pages for the encyclopedia. And this is an example of what a couple of children achieved. And this so involved the community that adults got engaged in searching more into what was happening in the community, what was there, recording cultural aspects of natural linkages in the society. And this has now been taken on board completely by the Solomon Islands and forms part of a wiki format educational resource to which groups all over the Solomon Islands are adding details of fauna and flora. Next one, please. The Sandwatch project is an example of climate change education. This is a project that began in the Caribbean in 2001, and it brings children, youth, adults, non-governmental organizations together to work on beaches around their respective country, to protect the beaches against increasingly high levels of seas and so on and so forth, or pollution or biodiversity loss. And the students plan their work from within school. They engage with parents. They find out, for instance, about whatever interests them to do with beaches. They present it to the community, and out of that, the community develops a rectifying project. In the Cook Islands and the Bahamas, Sandwatch teams replanted native vegetation lost by hurricanes. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, they worked on campaigning against local fishermen who were polluting the beach, and so on and so forth. And what's so interesting about this is that there's a full curriculum which can be actually implemented across the curriculum, arising from the particular Sandwatch projects that students do. So again, a very close involvement with community. Next, please. Just to briefly end this up, an example from France of student risk ambassadors, something that started in one particular city in France and has spread right across France, where students become risk ambassadors, going to the local archives, as in this picture, looking at old maps and old documents about hazards and disasters that have presented themselves to the city or town before, developing a portfolio of ideas for better protection of their own city, and in very many cases making a full-scale presentation to the local mayor. So students heavily engaged and upfront engaged in this work. Next one, please. Another example from Sierra Leone, where students in this particular community spend a lot of curriculum time developing a program. And they do a bi-weekly, a fortnightly program out into the community, listened to by about 250,000 people in the particular area, who listen to what the students have got to say about disasters, vulnerabilities, building resistance, and so on. Next slide, please. Just an example of student action across the curriculum as analysers, designers, communicators, mobilisers, constructors, engaging with adults and community members, and all from very clear curriculum areas, and combined and interdisciplinary curriculum areas too. Next, if we see then, and I'll summarise here, if we see curriculum as using the old Latin cohere, the race of life, as the totality of student experience in the process of learning, my question, next slide, is where does curriculum begin and where does it end? Things I've mentioned are student involved in fostering and maintaining an institutional culture of safety and resilience. If you do that, and if students are heavily engaged in committees in their school, in campus change efforts, etc., that tipples out and into what happens in curriculum time. Student engagement in and with the community, seeing the school as the hub of DRE and climate change education, and the students being key agents in taking that out into the community and bringing expertise into the school in return. And very much the idea of shifting the perception of the school as one of a teaching community to school as a learning community. This profoundly involves the students in all kinds of ways, in what happens in school, what happens in the community. Next slide, please. And so when I was approached by Doug to do this, it was on the basis of how much curriculum time is there? And I guess my question the questions I've got out of what I've said are, how do you calculate time available? What is curriculum time? what is extracurriculum time, or are we eroding the difference between them? Especially if you take this larger holistic view I've put forward, is it calculable even? Whose time are we talking about here? Time for what? There's planned time, token time if you like, but does it actually happen in schools here? Or are we talking actual and quality time? And does that quality time happen in the classroom or as we move out and engage with the community? There's the question of measured time versus diffused time. And I guess you could, one reading of what I'm saying is that the work in the school, the engagement in the school, which comes into the classroom, is a kind of diffused time. And where's the demarcation between the two? Next slide, please. Which is to say thank you to you. That's my email address, and that's our organisation if you want to know more about what we do. Thank you. Thank you, Mohini. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, David, and we'll come back to those questions you've raised in the discussion for sure. Perhaps if you keep that slide from David and the earlier slide of that circle with all the different possibilities of time, both within the classroom and within the school day and within the community, that's one, hopefully a frame of reference. One of the things that the FRESH framework states strongly is that countries need to focus their resources. And as you well know, schools are faced with so many health and social and sustainable development issues that it's very important that each country, each community select the issues and conditions and behaviors that they need to address, and they need to do it on a data-driven basis. And so that's really the point that I'll start with, and that's not always the case. You can take a step back, and if you look at the availability of good data for countries to make those kinds of decisions, there's often a data scarcity. But it's important to keep that sort of focus of resources message at the top of our agenda. Here's a couple of other issues that that are very important that I'd like to talk about briefly. We in the health sector in particular, but other sectors too, there's a lot of very good and proven educational programs on specific topics, be it HIV/AIDS or substance abuse or hygiene and wash programs, but we've not really tracked how those instructional programs fit within an overall core health, personal, social development curriculum. Most of the research, if you read the articles carefully, the control group and the program group often don't have a description of whether they're being delivered within an existing core program or whether they're being simply developed and tested on their own. The second point, and this was one that concerns me a lot, is that the classroom instructional time devoted to HPSD education is almost an unknown item in almost all national reporting and in most global survey instruments and in topic-focused research and practice. It's a gap that should be part of our discussion in all three of those kinds of reporting, and it's not. Another area that I'll talk about briefly is the curriculum structures. How are we organizing the curriculum or the subjects, if we want to save the word curriculum as in David's use of it as what we want students to learn overall? If we look at subject structures, the curriculum, the structures that are being used are not known or not compared for what they're delivering. And the last is coherence. We might add another C to David's 4C model, which is coherence. If we're going to try to mobilize all those different elements of that circle diagram, there needs to be some coherence about what are the general and generic skills that we're trying to develop. And again, most of the reporting that's done, well, in the research, it's clearly done on topic-based studies, but even in the global reporting, it's often adding up topics rather than looking at generic skills. And that makes the transfer between health and sustainable development issues and safety issues easier if there's that kind of coherence. First point about one of those is the time. In 1985, and this is one of the first articles that I read when I started working on school health promotion in 1988, is this study that came out. It's a U.S. study, large scale, 30,000 students were involved, and it found that 40 to 50 hours of good quality health education did have an impact on attitudes and behaviors. Less than that 50 hours had an impact on knowledge and some attitudes, and as you went down the number of hours delivered, the impact was structured, was limited to knowledge. And that's part of the debate we've had a lot in health education and school health promotion has been, does knowledge alone change behavior? Well, that sort of colors it a bit if we're talking about instruction that has not been delivered at that kind of level. There's also another piece I've been trying to find out more research of this type, and there's almost none that's been done since 1985, but one done a few years later by Diane Allensworth, one of the founders of the school health movement in the US, looked at the impact of having a health curriculum over several years. And surprise, surprise, if the health curriculum was delivered over several years, the students who had gone through that, regardless of the topic, it was having an impact on behaviors. And so time does matter, and we need to look at it. The FRESH core framework, as an example, does ask about, and there are, the FRESH framework has core indicators, a set of thematic indicators and a set of core indicators, and it does ask about the frequency of health lessons. But as I read through it carefully in the last little bit, it's not that this well, first of all, the self-assessment tool has not been used very widely, and the WHO and the World Bank tools surveys do not ask about time. So the FRESH framework is the only one that has some questions about the frequency of health lessons delivered at the school level. So the picture is pretty sketchy. I've been doing some searching through national and state curricula documents, and thus far we found some interesting things. First of all, that some curriculum documents, not all, but some, do recommend a time available to leave available for the subject area of health or life skills education, but they probably have to leave the final decision to local educational authorities, schools, or teachers. And some studies show that the local school districts or the schools do not necessarily follow those recommendations. The data is very sketchy. Again, there's very few studies that have done that vertical tracking down into the system as to what's actually delivered, but it's an important piece of what if we're trying to figure out what's going on, that's an important piece. Conversely, many curriculum documents do include a minimum time for physical education, but not for health and personal and social development education. This was kind of a surprise to me, at least. I've been asking people who work in the field how much time they're taking out of the school day or in the classroom in terms of delivering the health education or life skills education, and most people don't seem to be able to answer that question. And so that's kind of scary from a systems point of view, and particularly if you go back to a medical language of dose and duration and intensity of the intervention. If we don't know about dose, duration, and intensity, then it makes it much more difficult to evaluate where we're at. However, a colleague and friend who's been active with probably the best data source, maybe even the only data source from a national perspective, the U.S. School Health and Policy Survey, they did ask questions. They do ask questions every 5 years now about the time spent in instruction, and it's a teacher-reported school-level data that they use. And if we look at the data set that is available, it comes out to about 20 hours per year for elementary schools. It varies slightly by grade level, and for secondary, it's about 30 hours. Another question in that survey, and again, it's one of the few available, it seems each topic seems to take about 4 or 5 hours of instructional time. And in speaking with this colleague, and we'll have her back for another discussion, is that it seems to take 4 or 5 hours of instructional time each year to cover a topic reasonably well. So that kind of gives us a time frame to look at. We have no data from low-resource countries or from countries that have been conflict or disaster affected, but it would likely be that those countries have less time available because the schooling time is more challenged in both of those contexts. if one does the math, and that's the last point on the slide, if you take 2 classes of 45 minutes per week, or 3 classes of 30 minutes, that's in the secondary school, or if you take 3 classes of 30 minutes in an elementary school setting, then it gives us about 150 minutes per week times the 40 weeks of kids are in school, and that gives us about 100 hours of potential instruction. But if we're looking at actually the only data we seem to have available, it looks like it's about 20 or 30 hours actually being delivered. And again, going back to that study, if we're looking at 40 or 50 hours to make an impact, and then that's kind of it's again concerning. Not going to spend too much time on this slide, except that curriculum structures will affect the time and the impact of what's being done. These are the different models, and you can probably have variations even among these. A standalone health education curriculum or a standalone life skills curriculum, and sometimes they're used interchangeably. You can have health education combined with physical education, and usually the health education is less than 1/3 of the time in those models, combined models. Health education has been combined with career or personal planning. We have personal and social health education that's used often in European countries, and particularly, and then we have personal and social health education combined with what we used to call home economics or financial literacy, and that's the model that's being promoted in England. And then we have the cross-curricular approaches with or without an overarching kind of competence, student learning competencies framework. Those different curriculum delivery structures or subject structures, if we want to say that word curriculum, there's been very little comparative studies about what is the best structure to use in different circumstances. And again, time will matter. Last point before we get into discussion, there are a number of generic skills, attitudes, and beliefs that people talk about. There are variations in the research and in practice that we talk about life skills, and there's definitions of life skills. There's discussions of health literacy, and there's variations on that. And so this is an attempt to and these are reflective of several different kinds of descriptions of these kinds of generic skills. But if you look at the list, it's knowing the ground rules and vocabulary, being able to discuss health and social issues in a factual yet sensitive way, setting that up in class, but also having the students being able to conduct those discussions with their peers, with their parents in a reasonable way. There's functional and practical knowledge that is geared to daily living as opposed to interesting or sensational facts about the health issue. And I jump back to the time when I was involved in one province and writing an HIV curriculum, and we were adding a lot about T cells and all that kind of stuff. And it really, in terms of behavior, is not really relevant. But it was all the rage of the day was to look at that kind of, where did AIDS come from and all that kind of stuff. So functional practical knowledge, knowing in that case, not so much about T cells, but knowing that you can have HIV or an STI and still look healthy. And that was the kind of functional knowledge that we need to think about. Life, decision-making, social emotional skills, coping skills, as well as specific social situational skills. Again, that's often talked in specific terms, and those concepts are all elaborated upon in the research and in practice. Normative beliefs and awareness of social influences and accurate perceptions and beliefs about the issue, again, well reflected in the research, not so much in the practice documents, but those often underlie the curriculum documents. Knowledge of self-concept, behavioral intentions. I'm not going to spend too much time on the slide. Being able to access social support, being able to access health and social and other kinds of services, not only health services, willingness to help others, and of course the needs for specific populations and higher risk situations. So if the students are in those groups or in those situations, they need to have particular information that's relevant. And then also making the connection to other parts of their lives or other curriculum areas. And so that's a set of generic skills and attitudes and beliefs and functional knowledge that we might want to think about that would give some sort of coherence if we're looking at organizing all those bits and pieces in the school day and in the community. One of the conclusions that at least I've reached so far in looking at this is that we really have talked about skills-based education, but in fact the reality is more topic-based. We found that the generic skills that I've just shown are not really used as an organizing device for much of the curricula. The FRESH framework, for example, does have a general definition of generic skills. It's a paragraph in the FRESH framework, but it goes on to be quite a little bit confused about what we talk about health, content, and skills-based pedagogy, which are two different things. And then in the list of 25 recommended topics in the FRESH framework, 3 are skills-based, and the other 22 are really topic-based. Similarly, the WHO draft questionnaire on school health policy and program at the global level has 6 skills and 15 content areas. The World Bank school health questionnaire, as part of their SAVER program, has really asked about 4 health topics, and then has a list of other issues, that an open-ended question, and another question that's a little bit confusing as well about life skills for health behaviors. Some of the curriculum that we've looked at thus far recommend a balanced curriculum, but they define that as one that covers a variety of health topics. So the conclusion that we're hoping, I'm hoping that our research network that Dan chairs will be looking at in depth is doing some really good content analysis of the documents, the national and state curriculum on health and personal and social development education is one of the steps moving forward. So, and I'm seeing that there's good discussion, so we'll be able to, and have the discussion when we finish up here. And I'm just going to go to the next slide, which I think is, yes, it's not. So that's where I'll stop and ask Dan to take us up to a bit of an overview, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion.
Great, thanks. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity to comment on these 2 presentations and kick off the discussion. A lot of really interesting and important information presented. And I'll try to speak at a higher level, and I'll try to be real quick so we have more time for audience engagement. But I think you both touched on a real core issue that we face in trying to figure out how to scale up this change, and that is the role of the school as a hub of the community. And in particular, the importance of schools within their communities. And you can see this in most contexts with what happens when a school is closed. Clearly, communities already, parents, students, and other members of the community already see the schools as centers of their local reality, and are already partners in education. And so I think that's a really important thing to try to tap into. And when you think about the overlap of curriculum, campus, and community within a broader culture, I think that's a very nice way of identifying that. One of the other challenges we face when we think about the schools as a center of community, and we think about children as functioning in a train-the-trainer model and taking that knowledge home, as well as giving the parents the opportunity to come into the school and learn more. And I think this touches to some of the things that Doug was talking about, is that frequently we think of this in a topic-based format, and that is, what is the current crisis of the day? What do we have funding to address? And we don't necessarily think about what are the local needs, what is the context, either at the country or at the district or at the school or right down into the community. What are their needs and how can we best support that? And so I think shifting a little bit to talking more about health, not as a physical or programmatic or topic-based thing, but health as a community health term. So healthy child, healthy families, healthy communities, and how can the school play a role in advancing the health broadly writ of the community in which it's embedded. One of the other challenges with a lot of the topic-based health, and when we talk about health, is that it's frequently embedded in social norms and taboos within the community that make it very difficult to figure out how to directly talk about and address many of the issues that are effectively elephants in the room. And so figuring out a way to really engage the community in talking about the issues that are important of importance at that time and in that place within the broader advancement of child and family and community health is really important for activating change and getting participants engaged. And so that urgency versus incremental longer-term change prioritized around local needs. So those are the things that really stood out to me in listening to this presentation. I don't want to monopolize all of our time because we're already close to the end, so I'm just going to stop here and turn it over to a broader discussion. But really, lots of interesting and important information in these presentations, and I think you really touched upon it when we think about what is the role of the school within the community in advancing these change initiatives.
Okay, opening up for discussion, there were some comments and questions raised on the side. Mohini, are you fully online? Do you want to manage this, or should I?
Doug, I am, but I think since the discussion has been going on and you've been touching on many of the points, it would be good if you could continue and talk on some of those points that have been raised, and Dan also summarized it very well, and I'll take a minute at the end just to close out, but please continue.
Okay. First, I'm going to ask David to jump in and talk a little bit more about the questions he raised in his slide, and also maybe how all these different pieces that I've gone back to the slide, how they might be fit better within a curriculum. I hesitate to use that word because it has, but anyway, the overall learning of the child about health and social and sustainable development. David, do you have a comment that we can start out on?
Yeah, I just begin by repeating what I said before, that I think you may, if you want to work on time, I think there may be, I'm envisaging a two-color diagram at least, where there could be a core solid curriculum area where you can actually denote the particular time, but there's going to be further circles out there of diffuse time if you take these community and school-based approaches of which I've been talking. My other comment, responding to the lists, Doug, you offered, is that I think there's a danger with the life skills term, and the danger of that term is that it can lead to giving attitudinal or dispositional learning outcomes short shrift. I'm just thinking of work Fumio and I have just done for the Northwest Frontier Province of Pakistan on learning outcomes, and had to go through their draft learning outcomes document. And so many of the so-called attitudinal outcomes that were being presented were not attitudinal. They were either skills-based or knowledge-based. As an example of an attitude, knowledge of cooperation, well, strictly speaking, that's a knowledge goal. And I think there's still an overweighting towards skills and not sufficiently to the integration of attitudinal or dispositional learning outcomes in what we do.
Okay, thank you, David. I'm going to go to the list of questions, and Farman has asked a question about it involving adults as community members and also members of the Parent-Teachers Committee, and asked if that question could be posed. It is, if you look on the lower left-hand side of this diagram, school-linked activities with parents is on the list. But maybe, David, if you could respond, when the students were doing the projects, were their parents involved as well, or did they?
Yes, if I didn't give that impression, I apologize. In each case, parents and/or community members were involved. And within the same work we've been doing in Pakistan, to enable this to work, we've used cascade models of training coming down from regional educational authorities down to local areas, and indeed teacher training and parental conscientization of the model, to make the students, make the parents more open to and positive towards student engagement in the community. It's been a considerable paradigm shift, but it's beginning to bear fruit, I think. There has to be a conscientization of parents and community members to go with this, and then they start seeing the value.
Excellent. And Mohini asked a question raised by the dose and duration and intensity, and finding time within the school calendar is always a challenge. And so the cross-curricular, and if I can extend that to sort of not only within the classroom but in the school day and out into the community, this becomes more practical if we can start to mobilize at different times of during the school day and after the school day for learning. My question is if it really goes back to the main message of FRESH, which is we need to focus our resources. All these different activities, all these different learning opportunities are being used in most situations, but they're used on different topics and different issues and it ends up being a whole lot of really good projects without any real in-depth learning that David just described, going into attitudes and getting at some of the things that underlie behavior, and I'd say most of the time it's really just looking at knowledge, particularly in the classroom. So the question of coherence and looking at how a country or a community or a school can really zero in on the things that matter, recognizing the limits of the classroom, recognizing the possibilities of going outside the classroom and into the community. And so that's the kind of coherence I think we need to try to find, both in research and practice. Mohini, I don't know if that's answered your question, but certainly that's mobilizing all these elements would be good. Quick response to Anna, sharing the reference, the second one that's not on the screen. I will do that. In fact, the working group will have a bit of a paper, and there's a couple of other references I hope to find that I'll add, and we'll share the paper on the FRESH website and elsewhere.
Doug?
Yep, go ahead.
I wanted to jump in and emphasize your previous point. I think we've made a lot of progress in talking, at least in some contexts, around healthy child and healthy communities. And I think if we can shift from the idea of community health, which has a very programmatic kind of emphasis, to the idea of how do we create healthy communities, and talking about mental, physical, intellectual health, and all of the subtopics that may be subsumed there, we can begin to bring that broader systemic approach to what does our community need, and how do we advance that, and how do we get there, and how do we use the school as a hub for engaging with the community in creating a healthy community.
Great. I'm just scanning down the list of questions, recognizing we're close to the hour with our tech issues. I'm going to take a few more minutes, but since we had some delay, if we can look at, sorry, go ahead. Yep, David?
I think Dan's remark was really pertinent, and I would even suggest that you start thinking of a culture of health and well-being for school and community. Almost take the community out in terms of community health, but talk about a culture of health and well-being that you apply to school and community in an integrated way.
Okay, I'm following the discussion that's been started by Jane, looking at who was appreciative of the points being made in the webinar, and then looking at it from their work in school nutrition and the application to it, putting these pieces together, and I'm just looking for any the Food and Agriculture Organization is doing a paper on this and trying to figure out how to best engage educators. So that, again, comes into the coherence question, being able to look at how these different pieces fit together. And I guess I'm going to try to work towards a conclusion here. If we're looking at this wide scope, with these limited resources, both in terms of classroom instruction and in terms of organizing these other extracurricular and co-curricular and community-based learning, being focused on what we do and being able to identify those needs based on documented needs, not necessarily what the donor organization or the ministry has money for, but on real needs that are need to be addressed, which is those are the ones that are going to be sustainably addressed because the people on the ground recognize them as being needed to be addressed. How do we work towards that kind of coherence, recognizing both the potential and also the practicalities of what we've got here? And then also there, Jane's asked about questions about costs. So again, those are the kinds of points that we need to think about, and those are the kinds of points that the FRESH Working Group will be addressing. Even if you bring it up a level and look at the various paradigms, we're calling them, not just the issues, the specific health or social issues, but also the paradigms that are being used from health literacy to life skills to risk reduction to social emotional learning. Even if one takes it up to that level, the countries will need to sort out which paradigms are more relevant to them and to their students. And it comes back to that fresh message of focusing our resources carefully. I'm going to ask David or Dan if you have any final thoughts, and then I'll turn back to Mohini to finish up the session.
Hi there. Can I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Max Karanick. I live and work in Toronto. I do some things related to school health. I'm sorry, I hope it's not a problem I'm asking through the mic. It seemed a bit complicated to try and ask through the chat box.
Sure.
But I appreciate like points from Dan and from Dave about the need for sort of a broader perspective on the community and the whole child. And what I'm wondering, sort of along those lines, but a little bit different, and something that I think about a lot when I look at models in Canada, such as comprehensive school health, which has been sort of the prevailing model here. And what I see in that model is that one of the categories is curriculum, teaching, and learning, but that's sort of seen just as a health curriculum, teaching, and learning. And that's sort of what I'm seeing in terms of this HPSD theme as well, is that, we're talking about curriculum time, instructional time devoted specifically sort of to health, personal, social development topics. But I wonder, is there sort of any interest within the FRESH work or other people working on this to sort of see health, personal, social development in terms of all the instructional time? So for example, in a math class or in a chemistry class, to be applying that knowledge to HPSD themes, or to see how can social emotional skills be worked into the way the class is delivered. What I'm finding is that it seems sometimes very dichotomous to say we have HPSD time or health curriculum time, and then we have regular curriculum time. So that's basically my question. I hope it makes sense.
Yes, and very good question. And we'll be, I'm smiling as I say this, that's the area we're going to look at in terms of the next open web meeting of the FRESH Working Group, cross-curricular approaches like that. A quick comment is that it's easily done on a project-by-project basis. What I think, in my view anyway, is missing is the coherence, so that if we're looking at science or math, a health-related bit of learning is done in those curriculum areas, that it also fits within a scope and sequence of learning over the years. And it's often not. It's sort of a really good project that the students do, but it may or may not be connected to a sequential learning of objectives. The presentation that we're going to start with is actually from a woman who's working with the International Union for Health Promotion, but did a lot of work in Quebec mapping out that across the curriculum subject areas within what Quebec calls a competency-based curriculum framework. So that will be near the end of August, and watch for the details. Dan and David, any final comments?
I'll just jump in on that last question real quick. And I think one of the things that schools have long been known as is as centers of informal socialization. So we teach children appropriate social behaviors and personal behaviors and health behaviors, but most of that work is done informally or haphazardly. And I think the shift you're talking about, particularly when we think about going cross-curricular, is how do we take that informal socialization into particular areas of health and shift it into a much more formal mechanism for engagement and intentional socialization across the school. I think on the one hand, that holds great hope for really embedding the value and really advancing the health of the community. On the other hand, unless it's very carefully and intentionally addressed, you run into saying we do it everywhere and we actually do it nowhere. So I think there's a real tension there, but it's a really important place to continue the conversation. Thanks all for the opportunity to contribute.
David?
Yeah, thank you. I think the last question was a really important one. I think that a lot of effort needs to go, particularly in terms of skills and attitudes, or as I prefer to call them, dispositions, in finding the generic bulk of those. Because if we look at climate change education, health education, disaster risk reduction education, or whatever, all of these social educations, many of the attitudinal and skills outcomes are cross-cutting, and maybe what we have to do is imagine we're on an isthmus looking out, and we see several islands sticking out of the isthmus. Now the islands in my metaphor here stand for what is distinctive about these particular areas, and they do all have their distinctiveness. But if we put our frog person suit on and dive into the water, we see they're all linked by a substrata of rock, which is the commonality. And I think this is quite important in terms of time and in terms of coherence, being absolutely clear what is common skills-wise and attitudinal-wise about these areas, but also recognizing the differences. And I think those little islands standing out the water, a lot of that will be the knowledge or the knowledge outcomes.
Thank you, David. Mohini, do you want to? I see you posted a message thanking people already, but you please jump in and tell us about the next regular Fresh webinar, which is every mid-month, and please jump in.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, David. Thanks, Dan. It's been an excellent session. And as someone who works directly with schools, governments, and communities, all of the issues, the practicalities of delivering and really bringing across that change, I can really relate to. There are several aspects to look at in designing a curricular or a broader learning agenda and approach for kids in schools, and schools as a hub in the community, and it translates across really all subject areas, and we're seeing a huge shift. It's coming, but slowly, not as quickly as we'd like, with new approaches to the curriculum, moving away from the textbook model of rote learning and passing tests. So just wanted to end on a positive note, that I feel that all of the momentum of the work all of you are doing, the whole community is doing, is leading to that change that we're looking forward to. And thank you, Doug, for those announcements, and you know that there will be further discussions on the topic through the Fresh Network, and there are other groups also working on it. So anyone interested to stay engaged, please do reach out to us so we can connect you. We'd love to get your inputs as well. And moving on to the next Fresh webinar, which is in a month from now. It'll be on the 15th of August, and the topic will be on physical activity. And we'll be keeping with the theme of youth skills. It's International Youth Day on the 12th of August, so we'll be commemorating that day, and we'll be hearing from some of the programs that Save the Children has been involved in, and learning about one measurement as well as to the delivery, and what we've learned from the work that we've done, what changes has it brought about in physical fitness, physical activities, and besides that, the other aspects in terms of socialization, engagement, participation in school through physical activities. So look out for that. We will be sharing the recording of today's webinar. We'll also be posting it online, and the invites for the next webinar will be coming up at the beginning of August. So thank you, everyone, and have a good Monday, rest of your week, and stay tuned. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Doug.
Thanks. Moini, can you stop the recording, or your colleague that started it? Does it?
Sambi, are you able to do that? Are you still there?
Yes, it'll stop when we stop the call.